February 17th, 1944. Deep inside the USS Iowa, a mechanical Mark 1A rangekeeper is crunching a firing solution. High above, a state-of-the-art Mark 8 radar holds a lock on a target, while massive 16-inch shells are rammed into the breeches. Iowa is the apex predator of the American fleet, built specifically to hunt down and annihilate Japanese super battleships. In just a few minutes, she will unleash this destructive power against an enemy warship for the very first time. But here is the ultimate paradox of her World War II career. This first time her guns fire at an enemy ship will also be the absolute last. How does a warship engineered to annihilate entire fleets find herself with only one true target? The United States poured a staggering fortune in resources and millions of man-hours into the Iowa class. They were constructed for a very specific, catastrophic future. A decisive clash of steel against Japan's own leviathans, super dreadnoughts like Yamato, Musashi, and Nagato. For decades, naval doctrine had obsessed over this coming apocalypse. Iowa was the ultimate American countermeasure, armed with 9 barrels capable of hurling 1-ton shells across the curvature of the earth. Yet, the grand fleet action she was designed for simply never happened. Instead, her guns, forged to shatter the heaviest armor plate ever bolted to a hull, would spend the war waiting for an enemy that never arrived. This singular, bizarre engagement at Truk Lagoon is the key to that historical paradox. It is the only time the apex predator of the surface fleet was actually unchained. But watching this one-sided gunfight unfold reveals a deeper, colder reality about the nature of warfare. It shows exactly how the era of the battleship ended at the precise moment it achieved absolute technological perfection. To understand how this lethal machinery finally got its single chance to fire in anger and why it ended up hunting the wrong prey, we have to step back to early February 1944 and look at a fortress the Allies believed was impenetrable. I cannot write a script about this topic. Admiral Minichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, looked at the intelligence from that single American reconnaissance flight and understood exactly what it meant. The impenetrable veil over Truk Lagoon had been torn away. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had meticulously planned for the Kantai Kessen, the apocalyptic, decisive fleet engagement where their super battleships would systematically destroy the advancing American fleet in a single war-winning gunnery duel. Every officer of Koga's generation had been rigidly drilled in this exact scenario. But on February 11th, 1944, 6 days before the American strike force was scheduled to arrive, Koga made a decision that quietly signaled the death of that very doctrine. He ordered the combined fleet to run. Under the cover of the vast Pacific, the most lethal warships of the Japanese Navy quietly slipped out of the lagoon, retreating toward Palau and the home islands. The massive super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the fleet carriers, the heavy cruisers, and the precious fast destroyers, all the titans built specifically to cross the T and annihilate the American battle line, were withdrawn without firing a single shot. Koga saved his Navy by doing the one thing his entire military culture had trained him never to do. He actively refused to give the enemy a general surface engagement. The grand apocalyptic clash of steel leviathans that both navies had anticipated since the end of the First World War simply evaporated before the Americans even crossed the horizon. But Koga did not evacuate everything. Left behind in the sprawling anchorage was a doomed logistical tale. Dozens of merchantmen, vital tankers, fleet auxiliaries, and a handful of minor warships frantically trying to organize themselves into escaping convoys. Among them was the Katori. She was not a terrifying engine of war like the Yamato. She was an aging, sluggish training cruiser, recently pressed into the unglamorous role of convoy escort. Accompanied by the armed merchant cruiser Akagi Maru, the subchaser Shonan Maru No. 15, and the destroyers Maikaze and Nowaki, Katori was simply trying to shepherd her small flock out of the lagoon and safely back to Yokosuka. The men aboard these ships knew the Americans had scouted the base, but they had no comprehension of the sheer scale of the violence rushing toward them. Steaming relentlessly across the Pacific was Task Force 58, the most concentrated manifestation of naval destructive power the world had ever seen. The American Armada was bringing a massive, unresolved technological contradiction directly to Truk's doorstep. At the core of the fleet sailed 9 aircraft carriers, armed with over 500 strike aircraft, the undeniable, over-the-horizon future of naval warfare. But sailing right alongside them, screening the fragile flight decks, were the USS Iowa and her sister ship, New Jersey. They represented the absolute, polished pinnacle of the old model of war. They were closing in at over 30 knots, their magazines packed with thousands of armor-piercing shells, their mechanical analog computers humming, their fire control radars searching the empty skies. They had been sent across the ocean to murder Japanese battleships, but the battleships were already gone. Only Katori and her small escort remained, crawling out of the lagoon's northern pass at 17 knots, heading directly into the path of a machine designed to kill gods. That machine was moving through the pre-dawn darkness of the Central Pacific, hidden within a formation so vast it seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other. To understand the sheer disparity of what was about to happen outside Truk Lagoon, you have to look at the composition of Task Force 58. It was not merely a fleet, it was the industrial might of the United States, weaponized and pushed out onto the ocean. Under the command of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, the Armada operated with a massive, unresolved technological contradiction right at its core. Sailing at the center of the formations were 9 aircraft carriers, fleet carriers like Enterprise, Yorktown, and Essex, alongside light carriers like Cabot and Below Wood. Their flight decks were packed with over 500 combat aircraft. They represented the undeniable, over-the-horizon future of naval warfare, a system capable of projecting overwhelming lethal force hundreds of miles beyond the visual range of any ship. But steaming right alongside them, screening the fragile flight decks of the carriers from surface threats, were the USS Iowa and her sister ship, the USS New Jersey. They were the absolute, polished pinnacle of the old model of war. For decades, naval architects across the globe had tried to balance the holy trinity of battleship design: armor, firepower, and speed. Usually, to maximize one, you had to sacrifice another. The Iowa class simply broke the equation by using brute force and an unlimited budget. Driven by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers feeding 4 geared steam turbines, Iowa's power plant generated a staggering 212,000 shaft horsepower. It pushed 45,000 tons of hardened steel through the water at an astonishing 33 knots. When the ship was at flank speed, the vibration hummed through the deck plates. The bow wave rose like a solid wall of white water, and the massive vessel could keep pace with the fastest carriers in the fleet. She had been designed with one overarching strategic purpose: to hunt down the Japanese Kongo-class fast battleships, and to stand in the line of battle to slug it out with the rumored monstrous Yamato-class super dreadnoughts. To achieve this, she was armed with 9 16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 guns. Each of these massive steel tubes weighed over 100 tons. They were designed to hurl a high-capacity bombardment shell or a devastating 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell at a velocity that could crack the thickest hardened steel plates ever bolted to a warship. But having the largest guns in the world meant nothing if you could not hit a moving target on a moving ocean. The real terror of the Iowa was not the steel of her barrels, it was her nervous system. Mounted high on the battleship's superstructure, scanning the empty skies and the dark water, was the Mark 8 fire control radar. Unlike the optical rangefinders of the First World War, which relied on clear weather, daylight, and the steady hands of sailors, the Mark 8 pulsed radio waves through the atmosphere. It could see through pitch-black darkness, blinding tropical sun glare, dense fog, and thick battle smoke. It could detect an enemy cruiser hiding just over the curvature of the Earth and continuously feed its exact distance and bearing down into the armored heart of the ship. Deep below the waterline, safe behind multiple layers of Krupp-cemented armor plate, sat the plotting room. Here rested the true brain of the ship, the Mark 1A fire control computer. It was not a computer in the modern digital sense. It was a mechanical, analog marvel, a wildly complex box containing thousands of precision-machined gears, cams, servos, and differentials. It was designed to solve incredibly complex differential equations in real time, using physical movement to represent mathematical values. To hit a warship maneuvering 20 miles away, you cannot aim at where the ship is. You have to aim at the exact patch of empty ocean where the ship will be in the 60 to 90 seconds it takes for your shell to arc through the stratosphere and fall back down. The Mark 1A ingested a staggering amount of data to predict this future. Through electrical synchros, it received the enemy's range and bearing from the Mark 8 radar. It tracked the enemy's course and speed, but it also measured the Iowa's own speed through the water. It factored in the exact pitch and roll of the battleship as it rode the ocean swells, ensuring the guns would fire at the precise microsecond the deck was level. It calculated the wind speed and barometric pressure. It calculated the Coriolis effect, the actual rotation of the Earth beneath the shell as it flew through the air. It factored in the exact temperature of the smokeless powder bags sitting in the magazines, because warmer powder burns faster and throws a shell slightly further. It even accounted for the microscopic wear and tear on the rifling inside the gun barrels from previous shots, which subtly altered the muzzle velocity. The mechanical computer processed all of these chaotic, changing variables instantly, automatically adjusting the elevation and traverse of the massive turrets on the deck above. The Iowa was, quite simply, the most sophisticated, deadly gunnery platform the human race had ever constructed. But as dawn broke on February 17, 1944, a strange, frustrating reality washed over the crews manning those incredible machines. The great battleships were doing nothing. Long before the Iowa or the New Jersey could even hope to see Truk Lagoon on their surface radars, the flight decks of Task Force 58 turned into deafening hives of activity. The carriers turned into the wind. Radial engines coughed blue smoke, roared to life, and drowned out all other sound on the ocean. Wave after wave of F-6F Hellcat fighters, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and SBD Dauntless dive bombers clawed their way into the sky, formed up into massive strike packages, and headed over the horizon. The battleships were left behind, steaming in protective circles, acting as mere bodyguards and anti-aircraft platforms. The apex predators of the surface fleet were relegated to watching vapor trails fade into the distance. Miles away, the American aircraft fell upon Truk Lagoon with apocalyptic fury. The Japanese had considered the base an impregnable fortress, but the reality of the new air-sea war shattered that illusion in minutes. American fighter sweeps systematically wiped out the Japanese defending aircraft, both in the air and on the ground at the Eton and Moen airfields. With air supremacy established, the dive bombers and torpedo planes went to work on the lagoon. They dismantled the infrastructure. They bombed the fuel storage tanks, sending massive columns of thick, oily black smoke miles into the sky. And they turned their attention to the dozens of merchantmen, tankers, and auxiliary ships trapped in the anchorage. It was a slaughter. For the officers and men standing on the bridge of the USS Iowa, listening to the chaotic, triumphant radio chatter of the carrier pilots, the realization was stark. The strategic outcome of Operation Hailstone was already being decided, and the battleships had not fired a single shot. The carriers were destroying the Gibraltar of the Pacific entirely on their own. The immense naval gun, the weapon that had defined global empire and naval supremacy for half a century, suddenly felt like an anachronism, a spectator to its own war. But out on the edge of the destruction, desperately pushing through the North Pass of the atoll, the small Japanese convoy led by the Katori was trying to slip away. Captain Tamaki Oda stood on the bridge of his aging training cruiser, acutely aware that his ship was entirely unfit for modern combat. The Katori was slow, lightly armored, and armed with outdated weapons. She was never meant to be on the front line, let alone facing the wrath of Task Force 58. Behind her steamed the armed merchant cruiser Akagi Maru, loaded with personnel and cargo, along with the subchaser Shonan Maru No. 15. Flanking them were the only truly capable warships in the group, the fleet destroyers Maikaze and Nowaki. They were fast, heavily armed with the deadly Type 93 long lance torpedoes, but they were vastly outnumbered. They had cleared the lagoon. They were making 17 knots, heading for the open ocean, hoping the American carriers were too busy devastating the main anchorage to notice them. But the ocean had changed. The sky was no longer a safe roof. It was a vantage point. American carrier planes, orbiting high above the smoke of Truk, spotted the wakes of the fleeing ships. The radio calls went out, and strike aircraft banked sharply, diving toward the escaping convoy. For the Japanese sailors, the terror was absolute. There was no honorable surface duel, no matching of broadsides. The violence came plunging out of the clouds in terrifying, screaming dives. The Akagi Maru was targeted first. Dive bombers plummeted from the sky, releasing their payloads with devastating precision. Heavy bombs tore through her decks, detonating deep inside her hull, sparking massive secondary explosions. She began to settle into the water, doomed, her crew scrambling for survival. Then the aircraft turned their attention to the Katori. Captain Oda ordered evasive maneuvers, the old cruiser carving frantic, jagged wakes into the sea, her anti-aircraft gunners firing desperately into the sky. But the mathematics of the air war were impossible to defeat. An Avenger torpedo bomber dropped low to the water, releasing its weapon. The torpedo struck the Katori squarely on her port side, tearing a massive hole in her unarmored hull. Tons of seawater rushed in. Almost simultaneously, a heavy bomb from a Dauntless struck her deck, blowing a shower of steel and fire into the air. The cruiser shuddered, her engines failing, a heavy list developing as thick smoke poured from her superstructure. The destroyer Maikaze was also hit, taking bomb damage that crippled her steering and slowed her down. Only the Nowaki, commanded by a captain executing brilliant, violent, evasive maneuvers, managed to avoid direct hits, her engines screaming as she threw herself left and right to dodge the falling bombs. Aboard the burning Katori, the situation was hopeless. The ship was dying in the water. The anti-aircraft fire dwindled. The sailors looked up at the sky, waiting for the final wave of American aircraft to return, drop their remaining bombs, and send them all to the bottom of the Pacific. It was the brutal, impersonal reality of the carrier war. High above, the pilots of Task Group 58.3 were doing exactly that. They were circling the crippled Japanese ships like sharks. They radioed back to the fleet that the merchantman was sinking, the cruiser was burning and dead in the water, and the destroyers were damaged. The strike leaders organized their planes, assigning targets for the final, lethal dives. They armed their remaining ordnance, adjusted their throttles, and prepared to wipe the convoy from the surface of the ocean. And then, a radio transmission sliced through the American tactical net. It did not come from the Air Group commander. It came directly from the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, the battleship USS New Jersey. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the quiet, meticulously calculating mind who had engineered the miraculous victory at Midway, was a man who rarely acted on impulse. He understood the carrier war better than almost anyone in the Navy. Yet, standing on the flag bridge of the New Jersey, Spruance issued an order that stunned the aviators circling above Truk. He ordered the aircraft to immediately break off their attack. "Do not sink that ship," the order crackled through the headsets of the confused pilots. The aviators were explicitly instructed to pull up, keep their distance, orbit the area, and do nothing more than track the fleeing Japanese vessels. Down on the ocean surface, Spruance was making an unprecedented tactical move. He signaled Task Group 50.9, a specially formed surface action group, to detach from the carrier screen. He was not sending aircraft to finish the job. He was taking the battleships. Spruance took personal command of the detachment. He pulled the USS New Jersey and the USS Iowa out of the formation, accompanied by the heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans, and a screen of 4 destroyers. The massive turbines of the battleships roared as they increased speed, cutting away from the carriers, accelerating to nearly 30 knots, and charging directly toward the horizon where the Japanese ships were burning. The decision was bizarre, and it remains a subject of intense debate among naval historians. Why would a brilliant, calculating fleet commander pull his aircraft away from a guaranteed kill, only to risk his most valuable, multi-million-dollar battleships in a surface engagement against ships equipped with deadly long-lance torpedoes? Some staff officers later suggested Spruance wanted to spare his aviators from unnecessary risk against desperate anti-aircraft fire, since the Japanese ships were already crippled and going nowhere. Others whispered a different, more psychological motivation, that the old surface warfare admiral, having watched the carriers win every major engagement, simply wanted to give his pristine, untested battleships a chance to finally fire their guns in anger. The crews of the Iowa and New Jersey had trained for years for a moment that seemed to be slipping away into history. Perhaps Spruance was simply throwing them a bone, giving the apex predators one final hunt before the carriers made them entirely obsolete. Whatever the internal motivation, the result was immediate. High above the Katori, the American dive bombers pulled out of their attack runs, banking away and forming a wide, distant orbit. On the battered bridge of the Japanese cruiser, the officers stared up at the sky in profound confusion. The deafening roar of the aircraft engines receded. The bombs stopped falling. The sky was suddenly, inexplicably clear. For a few fleeting moments, the Japanese sailors might have believed they had witnessed a miracle. They were crippled, burning, and taking on water, but the executioners had vanished. But their relief was a phantom, because just over the curvature of the Earth, racing toward them at over 30 miles an hour, the Mark 8 fire control radars of the USS Iowa were already sweeping the ocean. Invisible radio waves were already pinging against the steel hull of the Katori. Deep inside the armored citadel of the American battleship, the gears of the Mark 1A mechanical computer began to spin, crunching the variables, calculating the wind, the roll, and the rotation of the Earth. The most advanced, lethal gunnery system ever devised by human engineering was finally locking on to a living target. The aviator circling above did not fully comprehend what Admiral Spruance had just done, but his command handed the USS Iowa the exact type of surface duel she was built to fight. Even if his internal motives remained locked in his own calculating mind, the result was undeniable. The apex predator of the surface fleet was finally off the leash. Before the Japanese sailors on the burning deck of the Katori could even peer through the smoke to visually spot the silhouette of the approaching American dreadnought, the Iowa already had them perfectly mapped. The order to commence firing echoed through the armored citadel. Inside turret number 2, the powder bags ignited. 3 massive 1-ton shells erupted from the barrels, throwing a physical shockwave that flattened the ocean around the battleship's bow. The sheer physics of the attack were terrifying. These projectiles did not fly straight. They arced miles high into the stratosphere, spending dozens of agonizing seconds in flight, crossing the curvature of the Earth. For the crew of the Katori, there was no warning, only the sudden, deafening roar of displaced air before towering columns of water erupted violently on both sides of their crippled cruiser. A perfect straddle on the very first salvo. It was a demonstration of brutal, mathematical asymmetry. The Japanese gunners were firing back entirely blind, desperately shooting toward a giant they could barely see through the haze and the blinding sun glare. Meanwhile, an American analog computer already knew their exact distance, speed, and trajectory. The Iowa and her sister ship, New Jersey, systematically dismantled the Katori, burying the cruiser under a staggering volume of heavy shells. In a final, defiant act of desperation, the escorting destroyer Maikaze turned her bow directly toward the overwhelming American firepower. Pushing her engines to the limit, the destroyer launched a spread of deadly Type 93 long lance torpedoes, their white wakes streaking through the water and forcing the massive American flagships into rapid, evasive maneuvers. But raw courage could not outmaneuver radar-guided gunnery. Maikaze was swiftly annihilated by concentrated cruiser and secondary battery fire, joining the Katori beneath the surface of the Pacific. As the heavy smoke began to drift across the ocean, the overwhelming surface barrage seemed complete. But as the fire control operators stared at their glowing radar scopes, they realized the slaughter had left one tiny, miraculous survivor. The destroyer Nowaki, running her turbines to the absolute breaking point, had somehow slipped through the barrage. The radar blip was moving away at over 35 knots. The realization swept through the American bridge. The final Japanese ship was making a run for the open ocean. The great battleships adjusted their course and increased their speed, triggering a high-speed, over-the-horizon chase that would push the absolute limits of the American fire control system. What began as an overwhelming execution now transformed into a brutal, mathematical drag race. Down in the engine rooms of the USS Iowa, the Black Gang pushed the boilers to their absolute limits, vibrating the immense steel hull as the battleship surged past 32 knots. But ahead of them, the tiny Japanese destroyer Nowaki was fighting for her life. Pushing her own turbines to a screaming 35 knots, she was just fast enough to slowly, agonizingly stretch the distance between herself and the pursuing American Leviathans. The gap opened at 25,000 yards, then crossed 30,000, eventually stretching toward a staggering 35,000 yards, nearly 20 miles of open ocean. At this extreme distance, visual gunnery was physically impossible. The sun cast a blinding, brilliant glare directly across the surface of the Pacific, effectively erasing the Japanese ship from optical rangefinders. Iowa was now firing entirely blind. The apex predator of the American fleet was completely dependent on the invisible radio waves of her Mark 8 radar and the spinning brass gears of the mechanical computer buried deep in her hull. The massive 16-inch gun barrels elevated to their maximum angles. When they fired, the shells did not just fly across the ocean. They were hurled miles up into the stratosphere. They hung in the air for over a minute, crossing the curvature of the Earth before plunging back down at supersonic speeds. Aboard the Nowaki, the terror of those 60 seconds of hang time dictated everything. The Japanese crew knew perfectly well they could not shoot back. Their 5-inch guns could not reach even half the distance to the American dreadnoughts. They had no heavy armor plate to deflect a 1-ton armor-piercing shell. Their only defense was chaos. The American Mark 1A computer was an engineering miracle, but its mechanical brain relied on a linear prediction of the future. It observed the destroyer's current course and speed, then calculated exactly where that ship would be when the shells finally landed. Knowing this, the commander of the Nowaki refused to let the future be predictable. He did not run in a straight line. Instead, he threw his destroyer into violent, erratic, uncoordinated zigzags. He ordered hard rudders to port, then abruptly reversed to starboard, constantly throwing the ship off its axis and rapidly changing engine speeds. This desperate, unpredictable human maneuvering broke the analog computer's flawless mathematics. Over and over, Iowa's fire control system generated a perfect solution for a target that simply refused to be there when the shells arrived. Colossal pillars of water, dyed with the chemical colors of the American shells, erupted like skyscrapers just hundreds of yards from Nowaki's hull. Shrapnel tore through her rigging, and the shock waves slammed the sailors against the bulkheads. But time and again, the frantic twisting of the hull saved the ship from a direct, annihilating hit. It was the ultimate collision of advanced targeting technology against pure, desperate human survival. And slowly, the human element was winning. The distance crept past the maximum effective range of the radar. The blip on the glowing green screens began to merge with the background clutter of the ocean. The battered, exhausted Japanese destroyer miraculously slipped away, blending into the glare and disappearing over the horizon. Realizing that a 32-knot battleship would never catch a 35-knot destroyer with a 20-mile head start, Admiral Spruance finally stepped back from the chase. The order echoed down from the flag bridge to the armored turrets: cease fire. The colossal barrels of the USS Iowa slowly depressed, and her massive turrets rotated back to their neutral, centerline positions. Deep inside the armored citadel, the gears of the mechanical computer stopped spinning. For the sailors standing on her decks, listening to the roaring silence that followed the bombardment, it felt like a beginning. They believed they had just unleashed the apex predator of the surface fleet, finally opening the combat career of the most advanced battleship main guns ever constructed. They were entirely unaware that they had actually just witnessed its conclusion. The Japanese destroyer Nowaki, the single ship that had miraculously survived the most advanced radar-guided gunnery on the planet, had indeed escaped over the horizon, but her reprieve was temporary. She would survive for exactly 8 more months before history caught up with her. In October 1944, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Nowaki stayed behind to rescue survivors from the shattered cruiser Chikuma. Under the cover of night, desperately trying to flee a second time, she was detected by American cruisers and destroyers. This time, she could not outmaneuver the mathematics. She was hunted down and destroyed in the darkness by the exact same relentless American radar advantage she had previously evaded, taking her entire crew and the survivors she had saved to the bottom of the ocean. But the deeper tragedy of that February day at Truk Lagoon was not about a single destroyer. It was about the grand illusion of the battleship itself. Operation Hailstone proved that the decisive weapon of the Pacific War was no longer the heavy turret. The carrier aircraft of Task Force 58 had already completely annihilated the Gibraltar of the Pacific, crippling the fortress, sinking its ships, and effectively winning the battle long before the USS Iowa ever got within 20 miles of gun range. The historical irony is profound. The Iowa class was engineered to achieve technical perfection for a strategic purpose that had simply evaporated. The grand apocalyptic clash of steel leviathans they were built for was already obsolete. The super battleship Musashi would be overwhelmed by waves of carrier aircraft without ever firing her massive main battery at an enemy warship. The Yamato would suffer the exact same fate, sent on a desperate suicide mission and swarmed from the sky before she could even reach an enemy fleet. And the Iowa, possessing the greatest radar-guided gunnery system ever built, had proven that the old form of warfare technically worked right at the exact moment it no longer mattered. She had been built for an apocalyptic clash of steel, engineered to win a world-ending gunnery duel with the leviathans of the Japanese fleet that her commanders had anticipated for a generation. When her 16-inch guns finally received their one singular chance to show exactly what they were capable of, they worked flawlessly, proving beyond any doubt that the ultimate surface combatant had finally been realized. But as the smoke cleared over the Pacific and those massive turrets locked back into their centerline positions, the final paradox was already written across the ocean. The apex predator had functioned perfectly, yet the era she was built to dominate was already dead, and those great guns would never be needed to hunt another warship ever again.